Choi Min-jun once made a man disappear for looking at him wrong. Not killed, disappeared, erased, like he never took a breath on this earth. His hands had ended more lives than cancer. The scar on his left cheekbone was the last mark anyone ever left on him, because the man who put it there was found in 3 different zip codes. In East Baltimore, they didn't say his name out loud. They called him the Phoenix, and they looked at the floor when his black Escalade rolled past. That man was kneeling on my grandmother's bedroom floor. He had a bowl of soup in his scarred hands and tears running down his face, and he was blowing on each spoonful before lifting it to my grandmother's lips. Slowly, gently. The way you feed a child. The way someone once fed him. His burgundy suit jacket was folded on the chair. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. His men, 4 of them, armed, stone-faced, stood in the hallway between the bathroom with the dripping faucet and the closet where she kept her church hats, and not one of them moved. Not one of them breathed loud. Because their boss, the man who could unmake a human being with a phone call, was spoon-feeding a 74-year-old black woman in a blue housecoat, and her hand was on his head, her fingers in his hair, and she was saying, "That's right, baby. You eat too. You too thin. You always been too thin." She thought she was feeding him. She thought it was 1989, and he let her believe it. My name is Zuri Atkins. That woman is my grandmother, and 6 months ago, I didn't even know this man existed. Now, before I take you back to where this all started, let me just say, if you're already sitting there with your hand over your mouth, wondering why the most dangerous man in Baltimore is on his knees crying and feeding somebody's grandmother soup, you're exactly where I was. I didn't understand it either. But I promise you, by the time I'm done, you will. Hit that subscribe button and ring that bell, because this story is going to wreck you in the best way possible. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever seen a powerful man break down like that for someone who isn't blood? Share this with somebody who needs to cry today. All right, let's go back. 6 months, Ashland Avenue. The day everything I thought I knew became a lie. I drove 11 hours from Atlanta to Baltimore in a car with a cracked windshield and a check engine light that had been on so long I'd stopped seeing it. Miss Tori from next door had called me on a Sunday evening. "Baby, you need to come home. Your grandma is forgetting things." Forgetting things. Like misplaced keys. Like it wasn't the beginning of the end. The diagnosis came the same week I moved in. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. With early cognitive decline that the oncologist explained using words I had to look up later in the parking garage while sitting in my car eating gas station peanuts for dinner because I'd spent my last real money on toll roads. He said palliative trajectory and comfort-focused management and realistic timeline, and I nodded like those words meant something other than your grandmother is dying and you can't stop it. Helen Mae Atkins, 74 years old, 41 years of night shifts at Johns Hopkins Bayview, the woman who raised me after my mother decided motherhood was a season and her season had passed. She was disappearing. Not just her body, though that too, the weight leaving her like tenants from a condemned building, but the her of her, the woman who told doctors twice her pay grade to sit down when they got out of line. That woman was leaving. And in her place was someone who folded every blanket in the house every morning because the routine was still in her muscles even when the reason had left her mind. Someone who tried to get out of bed to cook for my grandfather who'd been dead 11 years. Someone who called me baby on the good days and stared at me like a stranger on the bad ones. I became her everything, her nurse, her cook, her calendar, her memory. Her legs when hers buckled, her hands when hers shook too hard to button the blue housecoat she wore every day because it was the last thing my grandfather bought her, and she would wear it until it dissolved, and I would sew it back together every time because some promises don't need words. I thought I was the only one taking care of her, The refrigerator told me I was wrong. It was full. Not the way mine was full in Atlanta. Leftover rice, some eggs, a bottle of hot sauce standing like a soldier in the door. Full the way refrigerators are full in magazines. Fresh vegetables, whole cuts of meat in butcher paper, real butter, and honey. 3 jars of honey lined up on the second shelf like they were waiting for something. "Grandma, where did this food come from?" "The church," she said. I called Greater Mount Zion on Federal Street. 42 years my grandmother had been a member. They said they bring Miss Helen a plate after Sunday service sometimes. A plate. Sometimes. Not butcher-wrapped meat and 3 jars of honey every 2 weeks. Then I looked at the house. The porch steps. Rebuilt. Not patched. Rebuilt. New wood. Properly sealed. The gutter that had hung like a broken arm for 2 years. Fixed. The basement that leaked since before I left for Atlanta. Dry. A new water heater. I called the City Housing Assistance Program. They had no record of Helen Mae Atkins. Then, the medical bills. Her oncologist, Dr. Kessler, was one of the best in Maryland. I'd spent 3 weeks begging for an appointment when I first arrived. Then one morning, they called me. Standing bi-weekly appointment, head of oncology. When I asked how, the scheduler said, "Someone made arrangements." I asked who. She said she wasn't authorized to share. I pressed. She said, "Ma'am, I can only tell you the account is covered. Fully. There is no balance." Fully covered. Best oncologist in the state. For a woman on Medicare in a crumbling row house on Ashland Avenue. Someone was spending serious money on my grandmother. Quietly. Consistently. Without asking for a single thing in return. And she either didn't know or wouldn't say. I found the envelopes on a Thursday. Kitchen drawer beside the stove. Rubber bands, old receipts, a screwdriver that didn't match any screw in the house, and a stack of white envelopes held together with a hair tie. No return address. No postmark. Hand delivered. I opened the first one. $100 bills. Flat. Ordered. I opened another. Same. Another. Same. 14 envelopes. $14,000 in a kitchen drawer next to a screwdriver and a rubber band. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the kind of anger that comes when you realize you've been excluded from the truth of your own life. My grandmother was dying in a house I couldn't afford to fix, under a doctor I couldn't afford to see, eating food I couldn't afford to buy, and somebody had been paying for all of it, while I scraped together $11 an hour bathing other people's grandmothers. The next Tuesday, I came home from Mrs. Covington's house and I smelled garlic. Not the powdered kind from the dollar store. Real garlic. Fresh. The kind that fills a kitchen from the floor up. I opened the door and there were 7 paper bags on the counter, and a man in a burgundy suit sitting at my grandmother's table, cutting sweet potatoes with the precision of someone whose hands had learned sharpness long before they learned vegetables. There was a scar on his cheekbone, a phoenix on his neck. His knuckles were scarred in a pattern that didn't come from cooking. And my grandmother was sitting across from him, smiling at him with a smile I hadn't seen in months. The real one. The one that rearranged her whole face around joy. And she looked at me and said, "Put that phone down, baby. He's family." He was not family. He was a stranger in a suit that cost more than 3 months of my rent, with men on the porch and an Escalade on the street, and hands that told stories his mouth never would. He stood up from the table. The room shrank. He wasn't tall, but the air changed when he was vertical. The way air changes before weather. A pressure drop you feel in your teeth. He reached into his jacket. My body did what every woman's body does when a man she doesn't know reaches inside a jacket. I stepped back. My spine hit the doorframe. He pulled out a card. White. A phone number. Nothing else. Set it on the counter beside the rice. "Your grandmother needs to eat," he said. Low voice. Unhurried. Accent that shaped the consonants differently, like the words had traveled through another language before arriving in English.
The soup will be ready in 40 minutes. The rice is in the cooker. She likes it softer than most people, a little more water.
How do you know that? He didn't answer, buttoned his jacket with one hand, walked past me, gave me space. The kind men give when they understand that closeness isn't always welcome. His men fell in behind him. Escalade door opened. He got in without looking back. The car sat for a moment, windows so dark they reflected the row houses like a black mirror, and then it pulled away and turned the corner, and my grandmother was humming in the kitchen. Humming a song I didn't recognize in a voice I hadn't heard in months, holding a jar of honey up to the light and turning it slowly like it contained every answer to every question I was afraid to ask. Grandma, who was that? Her eyes were clear, fully clear. I grabbed onto that clarity with both hands because those windows were getting shorter every week. That's my boy, she said, like she was telling me the weather. He's been coming here a long time. I should have told you, but I didn't know how to explain it, so I just let it be. She touched the honey. He always brings honey, every time, because I told him once that honey fixes everything, and he believed me. What boy, Grandma? What are you talking about? She closed her eyes. I watched her reach for it, the memory, like a woman reaching into deep water for something heavy and precious, feeling for it with her fingertips while the current tried to carry it away. 1989, she said. Winter. Lord, you don't know cold until you felt that harbor wind. I was coming home from Bayview, double shift, 16 hours. My feet hurt so bad I was counting steps to the front door. And I heard something in the alley behind Donovan's store. Her eyes opened, wet, shining. A little boy. A little Korean boy. 8 years old, maybe less. Somebody had beat him until his face was swollen shut. He was lying between the dumpster and the wall, shaking so hard his teeth were clicking. No coat, no shoes, blood everywhere. She looked at the chair where the man had been sitting, the wobbly one by the window, my grandfather's chair. I picked him up, carried him inside, cleaned him up, fed him rice and canned peaches. That's all I had. Let him sleep in Rodney's bed. And he stayed with me 3 months. 3 months, that boy was mine. Her hand was trembling, but her voice was iron. Then they came. Men in a black car. They took him. He grabbed my doorframe and screamed, Zuri. Screamed like they were pulling his soul out through his hands. And I stood on that porch and watched them put him in that car, and I couldn't do a thing. Not one thing. She wiped her eyes, quick, like she was angry at the tears for showing up. 31 years. I never saw him again. Then, 6 years ago, somebody knocked on my door, a man in a suit, and he said, Auntie Helen, do you remember me? And I looked at his face and, God help me, Zuri, I saw that little boy. My little boy. Grown, scarred, sad, but mine. She picked up the honey jar, held it the way you hold a hand. He brings honey every time, every single time. Because when he was 8 years old, crying in this kitchen with peach juice on his chin, I told him, Baby, put some honey in your tea. Honey fixes everything. And that man believed me. He still believes me. The soup bubbled. The rice cooker clicked from cook to warm. The kitchen light was amber, was honey, and my grandmother held the jar in her shaking hands. And I understood the shape of it, even if I couldn't see all the edges yet. Choi Min-jun, the Phoenix, the most feared man between Baltimore and Richmond. And for 6 years, he'd been coming to this row house, bringing groceries and paying bills, and sitting in a wobbly chair cutting sweet potatoes. Because in 1989, on the coldest night of the year, a tired nurse decided a bleeding boy was worth carrying home. And now that nurse was dying, and he was trying to save her back. And all his power and all his money and all those men who could make a person vanish from the face of the earth. None of it could stop what was happening inside her body. None of it could buy back the minutes her mind was losing. He could feed her by hand. He could bring honey every Tuesday. He could rebuild her porch and pay her doctors and fill her refrigerator until it looked like a photograph. But he couldn't keep her here, and neither could I. I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the white card in one hand and my phone in the other, and I searched his name, Choi Min-jun. And what came back was not a person. What came back was a weather system. A force of nature dressed in headlines that said things without saying them. Prominent businessman. Alleged connections. No charges filed. Witnesses recanted. I scrolled through pages of nothing that somehow added up to everything. No photographs, no social media, no interviews. Just the negative space of a man who existed in the gaps between what could be proven and what everyone knew. A seafood distribution company in Ellicott City that shipped more than seafood. A real estate portfolio that didn't make sense for a fish wholesaler. A name that appeared in court documents the way smoke appears above a fire. Always nearby, never the source. I found one photograph, grainy, taken from a distance at a fundraiser for the Korean American Chamber of Commerce. He was in the background, half turned from the camera, and even in that blurred image, the scar was visible, and his posture was the same posture I had seen in my grandmother's kitchen. The stillness of a man who was never not aware of every door, every window, every body in the room, and how quickly each one could become a problem. He was dangerous. Not the way men on the corner were dangerous, loud and temporary and burning themselves out like cheap fireworks. Dangerous. The way weather is dangerous, the way a river is dangerous. Quiet until it isn't, and by the time you hear it, you're already inside it. And this man had been sitting in my grandmother's kitchen for 6 years. I called the number on the card at 2 a.m. because I wanted whoever answered to be off guard. A man picked up on the second ring. Not Min-jun, someone else. His voice was flat and professional, and he said one word, yes, like that was all the English he intended to spend on me. Tell your boss to stop coming to my grandmother's house. Silence. Not the confused kind, the kind that comes from a man who is deciding whether to relay the message or handle it himself. I'll pass that along, he said, and hung up. The next morning, I went to the hardware store on Eastern Avenue. I bought new locks, 2 deadbolts, and a chain. I installed them myself because I had learned to install things myself the way women learn to install things themselves, not because they want to, but because the alternative is waiting for someone who isn't coming. I changed every lock on the house, front door, back door, the side door that led to the basement that nobody used, but that I wasn't taking chances on. I tested each one 3 times. I stood in the hallway with the old locks in a plastic bag, and the drill still warm in my hand, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. The brief, brittle illusion that I could decide who entered my grandmother's life and who didn't. He didn't come that Tuesday. I waited for it. I came home from Mrs. Covington's at the usual time, and I stood on the porch for a full minute before going in, scanning the street for the black Escalade, checking the corners, looking for men in suits standing too still. Nothing. Just Ashland Avenue doing what Ashland Avenue always did, existing in that exhausted way that Baltimore neighborhoods exist, not thriving, not dying, just enduring. The row houses leaning against each other like old friends too tired to stand alone. I went inside. No garlic. No grocery bags. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it that morning. My grandmother's oatmeal bowl in the sink. Her pills lined up on the counter in the weekly organizer I'd bought at the dollar store. The refrigerator humming its low, empty song. I checked the drawer beside the stove. No new envelopes. I checked the porch. No bags. Nothing had been left, delivered, or slipped through any crack I hadn't sealed. Good, I told myself. Good. It did not feel good. My grandmother asked about him on the third day. She was sitting in her chair by the living room window, the one she sat in every afternoon because the light there was warm and the window faced the street, and she liked watching the children walk home from school, even though she couldn't remember their names anymore. She was having a clear afternoon. Not fully clear, not the crystalline sharpness of her best days, but clear enough. She turned to me and said, "Where's my boy?" My chest tightened. "What boy, Grandma?" "My boy. The one who brings the honey." She looked at the window like she expected to see the Escalade. "He didn't come." "He's busy, Grandma. He'll come another time." She looked at me, and in that look was something I wasn't prepared for. Not confusion, not the fog, but clarity. Sharp, knowing clarity. The look of a woman who has been lied to by people she loves and recognizes the taste of it. "What did you do?" she said. "Nothing." Zuri Monique Atkins. Full name. The weapon of every grandmother who has ever lived. "What did you do?" "I changed the locks, Grandma. I don't know that man. I don't know who he is or what he wants, and I'm not going to let a stranger— He is not a stranger. He's a criminal." The word landed in the room like a glass breaking. My grandmother's face didn't change. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with the steady, patient sorrow of someone who has lived long enough to know that the world is not divided into criminals and good people, but into those who show up and those who don't. "He showed up," she said quietly. "For 6 years. That man showed up when nobody else did. Not your Uncle Terrence who calls himself blood but hasn't set foot in this house since your grandfather's funeral. Not your mother, wherever she is. Not the church, not the city, not the government." She paused. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You want to know what a criminal looks like, baby? A criminal looks like the people who should have been here and weren't. That man is not a criminal in this house. In this house, he is my son." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because she was right in the way that old women are right, not with logic, but with the accumulated evidence of a life that has been spent watching people choose and fail and choose again. She was right the way gravity is right. You can argue with it all you want, but your feet are still on the floor. That night, she wouldn't eat. I made her oatmeal the way she liked it, soft with honey. And the honey caught in my throat because there were only 2 jars left, and I didn't know where to buy the kind he brought. The kind in the glass jar with the wooden dipper. The kind that wasn't Walmart honey, that was real and thick and amber, and probably cost more per jar than I made in an hour. She pushed the bowl away. She turned her face to the wall. She didn't hum. She didn't fold blankets. She went to sleep at 6:30 in the evening, and I sat in the kitchen alone and listened to the silence where his presence used to be. He didn't come on Friday either, or the Tuesday after that, or the Friday after that. 2 weeks of nothing. And in those 2 weeks, my grandmother retreated. Not into the fog. That was coming anyway. That was the cancer and the cognition, tag-teaming her from both sides like they'd agreed to split the work. She retreated into something else. A sadness so deep and so quiet it didn't have symptoms. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just stopped. Stopped humming. Stopped reaching for the remote. Stopped looking out the window at the school children. Stopped asking what day it was. She folded her blankets in the morning, and she sat in her chair, and she waited for a knock that didn't come. And the waiting was doing something to her that the cancer hadn't done. The cancer was taking her body. The absence was taking her will. And the groceries kept coming. Not from him, not hand-delivered. But every Monday, a van from an organic market in Towson pulled up to the house, and a young man in a green apron carried bags to the porch and rang the bell and left before I could ask who was paying. I checked with the company. Prepaid account. Annual subscription. They couldn't tell me who set it up. The medical bills were still covered. Dr. Kessler's office still had her standing appointment. The water heater still worked. The porch steps were still solid. He had removed himself from her life without removing any of the scaffolding that was holding it up. That's when I understood something about the kind of man he was. A different kind of man would have punished me for changing the locks, would have cut the money, would have made me feel the withdrawal of his generosity like a fist. Min-Jun didn't withdraw the money. He withdrew himself. Because the money was never about power. The money was infrastructure. The visits were personal, and I had taken the personal away and left the infrastructure standing, and he had let me, because he understood the difference even if I didn't. But my grandmother was dying faster without him, and I was running out of the one thing his money couldn't buy: time. The grocery store was on a Saturday. I remember because Saturdays were the only days I didn't work at Mrs. Covington's, and Saturdays were the days I did everything else: laundry, pharmacy, cleaning, the accumulation of survival tasks that pile up when you are one person doing the work of three. My grandmother was asleep. Miss Tori from next door was sitting with her. I had 45 minutes to get to the store and back before Miss Tori's stories came on, because Miss Tori would sit with Grandma Helen out of love, but she would not miss her programs out of anything. I drove to the grocery store on Pulaski Highway. Not the organic market in Towson where Min-Jun's subscription delivered from, the regular one. The one with the fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly ill, and the linoleum that was supposed to be white but had surrendered to gray sometime around 2004. I had a list, I had a budget. The list was longer than the budget, which was always the case, which was the math of my life. Too many needs divided by not enough money. A fraction that never resolved into a whole number. I moved through the aisles the way I always moved through grocery stores now, with my phone calculator open, running a tab, making decisions that weren't really decisions, but triage. Ground beef or chicken thighs, not both. The name brand oatmeal she liked or the store brand that tasted like cardboard but cost $1 less. The honey, the regular honey, the plastic bear from the middle shelf, not the glass jar, never the glass jar. Or, no honey at all this week because the copay for her nausea medication had gone up again and the pharmacy didn't negotiate. I put things in the cart. I took things out. I put them back. I stood in the cereal aisle for 4 minutes staring at a box of the brand she used to buy me when I was little, the one with the cartoon on the front, and I calculated whether nostalgia was worth $3.49. And I decided it wasn't, and I put it back, and I moved on. At the register, I watched the numbers climb on the screen the way you watch a gas pump when your account is low, with your stomach tightening on every click. I had separated the essentials from the maybes. The essentials were on the belt. The maybes were still in the cart. The cashier scanned without looking at me. She never looked at me. I was invisible in this store the way I was invisible in most places. A black woman in scrubs buying groceries on a Saturday afternoon. A person the world had decided wasn't a person, but a background detail, set dressing for other people's lives. The total came, $63.17. I had $58 in my checking account. I knew this because I had checked it in the parking lot, twice. "Can you take off the honey?" I said. My voice was steady. You learn to keep your voice steady when the numbers don't work. You learn to say it like it's a preference and not a crisis. Like you're choosing not to buy the honey and not like you can't. Because the difference between those two things is the difference between dignity and something else. Something you can't afford to feel in public. The cashier voided the honey. The new total was $59.82. I was still short. I looked at the belt. Rice, oatmeal, chicken thighs, canned vegetables, bread. Her pills weren't on this belt. Those were at the pharmacy. That was a different number, a different defeat. "And the chicken," I said. The woman behind me sighed, not quietly. The kind of sigh that's meant to be heard. The kind that's a performance, An announcement to everyone within earshot that her time is being wasted by someone who can't manage basic tasks like buying groceries. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the register screen. The cashier voided the chicken. 54.12. That worked. That technically worked. Maybe she should have counted before she got in line, the woman said. Not to me, to the air, to the invisible audience that people like her imagine is always watching, always agreeing, always on her side. She said it the way people say things about you when you're standing right there, in that particular dialect of cruelty that pretends to be inconvenience. Some of us have things to do. I bagged my groceries. My hands were shaking, but my face was not. I had learned this separation a long time ago. The body can tremble as long as the face holds. The face is what they see. The face is what they judge. And I would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing anything on my face that she could take home and feel good about. I picked up my bags. 2 bags. That was all $63 minus the honey minus the chicken came to. 2 bags that I carried to my car in a parking lot that smelled like exhaust and wet asphalt. And I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the bags in the passenger seat where a person should have been. And I put my hands on the steering wheel and I cried. Not for the honey, not for the chicken, not for the woman in line or the cashier who never looked at me, or the fluorescent lights that made everything look like it was already dead. I cried because 6 months ago I had a job in Atlanta, an apartment, a life that wasn't much but was mine, and I'd given it up to come here, to this city that was eating my grandmother alive, to this house I couldn't afford, to this impossible math of caretaking where every day cost more than I had, and every night I lay awake calculating how much longer I could do this before the numbers swallowed me whole. I cried because I was 29 years old and I was choosing between honey and chicken. I cried because my grandmother was dying and the best thing I could do for her, the only thing that had made her smile in weeks, was a man I'd locked out of her life because I was scared of what he was. And I cried because the woman in the grocery store was right. Not about me, about the world. About how some people have things to do, and some people have survival to negotiate. And the line between them is made of money. And the money was never coming. And I was tired. I was so tired that tired didn't describe it anymore. There needed to be a new word for what I was. A word that meant tired, plus broke, plus scared, plus alone, plus watching the person you love most in the world forget your name one synapse at a time, and knowing that the only person who makes her remember is a man you told to stay away. I drove home. I carried the 2 bags inside. I put the groceries away. The oatmeal, the rice, the canned vegetables, the bread. No honey, no chicken. The refrigerator looked like a mouth with missing teeth, gaps where fullness should have been. Shelves that had been stocked 2 weeks ago with things I couldn't name or afford, things that came from a van from Towson, things that came from him. My grandmother was awake. Miss Tori had left. Grandma Helen was sitting in her chair by the window. She wasn't looking at the street. She was looking at her hands, turning them over slowly, examining them the way she sometimes did when the fog was thin and the memories were close, like she could see the years in the lines of her palms, like her hands were a book she was trying to read before the light went out. "Grandma," I said, "I'm making dinner." She didn't answer. She kept looking at her hands. "Grandma?" "I used to carry people," she said. Her voice was far away, present tense mixed with past. At the hospital, when they couldn't walk, when they were too sick or too scared or too heavy with dying to move by themselves. I carried them. I was strong, Zuri. I was so strong. My arms never got tired, not once, not in 41 years. I carried every single one of them. She looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, but not unfocused. She was here, fully here. Now I can't carry a cup of tea to my own mouth without spilling it. I sat on the floor next to her chair. I put my head on her knee the way I used to when I was 7 years old, and the world was a place that could be survived by being close to her. She put her hand on my head, her fingers in my hair, light as paper, warm as everything. "Let him come back," she said. "Grandma, baby, I'm not asking. I'm telling you. I don't have enough days left to spend them missing people. I missed him for 31 years. I am not missing him again." She said it the way she said everything that was final, without raising her voice, without tightening her grip, without any of the theater that lesser people use to make their words feel bigger. She said it the way the ground says it when you try to argue with falling. "I am not moving. You are." I called the number on the white card that night. The same flat voice answered. "Yes?" "Tell him the locks are changed. New key will be under the mat on Tuesday." Silence. Then, "Understood." Tuesday came. I went to Mrs. Covington's. I bathed her. I dressed her. I drove home with the windows down because February in Baltimore is brutal, but the cold kept me alert, and alert was all I had left. I parked on Ashland Avenue. The black Escalade was there, 2 men on the porch, standing like they grew out of the concrete. I walked past them. Neither one moved. Neither one looked at me. I opened the door. Garlic. The kitchen was full of it. Bags on the counter, the good bags, the tall brown ones from the market on Eastern Avenue. I could see celery and green onions and ginger and the unmistakable shape of a whole chicken. A whole chicken! Sitting in a bowl of water in the sink. And on the second shelf of the refrigerator, lined up like soldiers, like promises, like a man's way of saying everything his mouth would never say. 3 jars of honey. He was sitting in the wobbly chair, my grandfather's chair, cutting sweet potatoes. His jacket was off. His sleeves were rolled. The scar caught the light. The phoenix shifted when he swallowed. He didn't look up when I walked in. My grandmother was sitting across from him, smiling, humming. Her hands were steady, not because the tremor had stopped, but because something in his presence calmed the part of her that shook. She was watching him cut the way she used to watch my grandfather build, with the quiet pride of a woman who claims someone without paperwork. I stood in the doorway. He kept cutting. I watched his hands move, the scarred knuckles, the precise movements, the patience of each slice. These were hands that had done terrible things. I knew that. I had read enough in those late-night searches to know that the scars on his knuckles were not from sweet potatoes. But in this kitchen, on this Tuesday, in the amber light through the window, these hands were doing the only thing that mattered. They were making food for a woman who was running out of meals. I didn't say thank you. He didn't ask me to. I dropped my bag by the door, and I went to the counter, and I started unpacking the groceries he'd brought. And we worked in the same kitchen without speaking. The only sound, the knife on the cutting board, and the soup beginning to bubble, and my grandmother humming that song I still didn't recognize. And outside, the Escalade waited, and the men stood on the porch, and the world continued to be the complicated, merciless, occasionally beautiful thing it has always been. He came every Tuesday and Friday after that. I didn't leave when he came. I stayed. I watched. I learned. I learned that he took off his shoes at the door without being asked, that he washed his hands twice before touching food, once when he arrived, once before he cooked, that he brought the same knife every time, wrapped in a leather case, and he sharpened it on a stone he kept in his jacket pocket, the way other men keep pens. I learned that he knew where everything was in my grandmother's kitchen, every drawer, every cabinet, every hiding place for the good dishes she never used, and that this knowledge hadn't been acquired in 6 years of visits, but had been there since he was 8, since those 3 months when this kitchen was his whole world, mapped into his body the way your first home maps itself into yours, permanent and wordless. I learned that he never sat until she told him to, that he called her Auntie Helen, but she called him Baby, and sometimes, on her sharpest days, she called him by a name I didn't recognize, a Korean name, soft and short, and when she did, something in his face opened, just for a moment, like a door that had been locked for decades, cracking an inch to let in light. And then it closed again, and he went back to cutting vegetables with those terrible, gentle hands. I learned that he brought her things she never asked for. Not expensive things, specific things. A particular brand of lotion she'd used for years that I'd been substituting with generic because the original was $6 more. A set of hairpins like the ones she wore in photographs from the 70s. A blanket that was the exact weight and texture of the one my grandfather used to keep on his side of the bed. The one she had cried about losing in the move from the old house. The one I thought was gone forever. He found it. Or he found one exactly like it. I don't know which, and I didn't ask because the answer didn't matter. What mattered was my grandmother wrapping it around her shoulders and saying, "Oh, this feels right. This feels like home." How did he know these things? How did an 8-year-old boy sleeping in a stranger's house for 3 months in 1989 absorb enough detail to reproduce it 37 years later, with the precision of a museum curator restoring a room to its original condition? I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I understand it now. But I think it's this. When you are a child and the world has beaten you bloody, and someone carries you inside, and feeds you, and lets you sleep in a warm bed, and calls you baby, and puts honey in your tea, every detail of that place becomes sacred. You don't memorize it, you consecrate it. It becomes the template for every safe place you'll ever try to build for the rest of your life. And when that place is threatened, when the woman who made it is dying, you don't just show up with money. You show up with hairpins and lotion and a blanket that weighs exactly what safety feels like. He was rebuilding 1989 around her, one detail at a time. And she was letting him, because she remembered it too. The week settled into a rhythm. Tuesdays and Fridays, that was his schedule, as reliable as the tide. As fixed as anything in my life that wasn't medical appointments or medication refills or the slow, steady math of losing someone. He arrived between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. The Escalade parked in the same spot, 3 houses down, across the street, close enough to reach, but far enough not to draw the kind of attention that Ashland Avenue would gossip about for months. His men rotated, never the same 2 twice in a row. But they all had the same posture, the same silence, the same ability to stand on a Baltimore porch in February, like the cold was a rumor that didn't apply to them. He cooked. Every visit he cooked. Not the way people cook when they're performing generosity, the big gestures, the elaborate meals designed to impress. He cooked the way people cook when they understand that food is a language, and the person they're speaking to is running out of ways to hear. Simple things. Rice porridge with ginger when her stomach was bad. Sweet potato soup with sesame oil when she was cold. Braised chicken with garlic and scallions when she had appetite. He adjusted without being told. He watched what she ate and how much and how fast, and whether she closed her eyes when she swallowed, which meant it was good, or whether she turned her head slightly to the left, which meant she was nauseous but too proud to say so. He read her body the way her nurses should have been reading it, the way I tried to read it but sometimes missed because I was too tired, too close, too deep inside the emergency of her to see the details from the outside. I started sitting in the kitchen while he cooked, not with him, near him, at the table with my laptop, doing the paperwork that caregiving generates, insurance forms, medication logs, the endless digital trail of a body being managed by systems that care about data more than the person producing it. He didn't try to talk to me. I didn't try to talk to him. We existed in the same space the way two people exist in a waiting room, aware of each other, respectful of the silence, united by the thing they're both waiting for, even if they never name it. But I watched, and what I saw made the thing I thought I knew about him harder to hold on to. He washed her dishes by hand, not in the dishwasher, by hand. He dried them with the cloth from the drawer beside the stove, and he put them back in the exact cabinet they came from. He swept the kitchen floor before he left, every time, not because it was dirty, but because she had swept it every day for 50 years, and the ritual mattered, even if the reason had faded. He checked the locks on the windows. He tested the batteries in the smoke detector. He did these things without announcement, without acknowledgement, without the slightest indication that he expected anyone to notice or thank him. He did them the way you breathe, because stopping wasn't an option. One afternoon, a Friday, early March, I came out of the bathroom and found him in the hallway outside my grandmother's bedroom. She was asleep. He was standing at her door, not inside the room, not crossing the threshold, just standing there with his hand on the doorframe, listening to her breathe. His face was turned away from me. His shoulders were a straight line. The phoenix on his neck was still. And I stood at the end of the hallway, and I watched the most dangerous man I had ever encountered listen to an old woman sleep with the focused attention of someone who is trying to memorize a sound because he knows it won't last. He sensed me. His head turned, not fast, not startled, a slow, calibrated movement, like a camera adjusting. His eyes were dry, his face was composed, but there was something underneath the composure, something I recognized because I wore it too. The specific exhaustion of loving someone who is leaving. The tiredness that isn't physical but structural, built into the architecture of your days, so embedded in how you breathe and move and think that you can't separate it from yourself anymore. You don't carry it, you become it. He looked at me, I looked at him. We didn't speak, we didn't need to. We were the only two people on Earth who were losing Helen Mae Atkins, and in that hallway, for the first time, I understood that his grief was not smaller than mine just because his blood was different. Then the hospice evaluation came. The oncologist had been suggesting it for weeks. Comfort-focused care, he kept saying, which was the medical profession's way of saying, we've stopped fighting and started waiting. I resisted it the way you resist anything that makes the ending official. But the reality was that Grandma Helen needed more than I could give her. She needed pain management that went beyond the pills I sorted every morning. She needed monitoring I couldn't provide while I was at Mrs. Covington's. She needed the kind of care that exists in the space between living and not. The space where medicine stops trying to fix and starts trying to ease. And I hated that space, but I couldn't pretend it wasn't where we were. The hospice nurse came on a Wednesday. Her name was Patricia. She arrived at 10 in the morning carrying a clipboard and a bag, and the particular expression of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it has stopped being bad and become routine. She was white, mid-50s, hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked like a decision she regretted but committed to. She wore sneakers that squeaked on the hardwood. She didn't take off her shoes at the door. I noticed that. I noticed it because he always took off his shoes. Because my grandmother's generation noticed those things. Because a house is not a building, it is a territory. And how you enter it tells the person who lives there everything they need to know about how you see them. Patricia walked through the living room like she was appraising a property. Her eyes moved across the furniture, the photographs on the mantel, the crochet blanket on the couch that Grandma Helen's friend Dolores had made 20 years ago. She didn't comment on any of it. She didn't see it. She saw square footage. She saw hazard potential. She saw a case file with a body attached to it. She sat down across from my grandmother. Grandma Helen was having a mid-range day, not sharp, not gone, somewhere in the gray space between, where she could track a conversation but might lose the thread if it turned too fast. She was in her blue housecoat. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked at Patricia with the polite wariness of a woman who has spent her life in hospitals and knows the difference between someone who cares and someone who is doing a job. Patricia opened her clipboard. She began asking questions: medical history, medication list, pain scale, mobility, cognition. She asked them the way a mechanic asks about a car: systematic, detached, aimed at diagnosis rather than the person sitting in front of her. She didn't look at my grandmother while she asked. She looked at the clipboard. She checked boxes. She made notes in handwriting so small it looked like code. Then she turned to me. "Has she been wandering?" she asked, loudly, like Grandma Helen wasn't sitting right there. "Sometimes," I said. "At night, mostly." "Does she know where she is?" "Most of the time." Patricia nodded. She turned to my grandmother and she leaned forward and she spoke in that voice. That voice. The one that people use on the elderly when they've decided that old means stupid, that sick means absent, that a body in decline has no person left inside it. Loud, slow, over-enunciated. The voice you use on a dog you're not sure will bite. "Helen, do you know what day it is?" My grandmother blinked. Her mouth tightened. A tiny movement. A crack in the politeness. She knew what was happening. She always knew. Even on her worst days. Even when the fog was thick and the names were gone and the years collapsed into each other like cards in a shuffled deck, she knew when she was being disrespected. The body remembers what the mind releases. Dignity is stored deeper than memory. "It's Wednesday," my grandmother said, quietly, correctly. Patricia didn't acknowledge the answer. She made a note. She stood up and walked to the mantel. She picked up a framed photograph, my grandparents' wedding photo, 1972. My grandmother in white with flowers in her hair, and my grandfather in a suit he borrowed from his cousin. Both of them so young, and certain that looking at it sometimes felt like looking at people who hadn't been born yet. Patricia picked it up with one hand, held it at an angle, set it back down slightly crooked. Then she turned around and looked at the room, the way a person looks at something they've already decided about. "We'll want to declutter," she said. To me, not to my grandmother. About my grandmother's house. The house she had lived in for 46 years. The house where every object had a story and a reason and a place that Grandma Helen could find in the dark because her hands knew the geography even when her mind didn't. Too many tripping hazards. The rugs need to go. The side tables, that hat rack in the hall. She walked to the shelf by the window. She picked up the ceramic rooster, a rooster that had been in this kitchen since before I was born, that my grandfather had bought at a flea market in Annapolis because it reminded him of his mother's kitchen in South Carolina, that my grandmother talked to on the mornings when she forgot everyone else. Patricia turned it over in her hands like it was evidence. "All this clutter. We need clear pathways." She called it clutter. She called my grandmother's life clutter. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against my thighs. I kept my face arranged in whatever shape the moment required because I needed this woman's evaluation to go well. I needed hospice approval because the insurance depended on it, and the insurance was the only thing standing between my grandmother and pain that I couldn't manage with over-the-counter medication and YouTube videos on palliative care. I needed Patricia to check the right boxes and sign the right forms, and I could not afford to make an enemy of a woman who held that power in her clipboard. But Grandma Helen could. "Put my rooster down," she said. Patricia looked up, startled, like a piece of furniture had spoken. "That's my husband's rooster. You put it down right now." Patricia set it down. She blinked. She recalibrated. She turned to me with the expression of someone who has just been reminded that the patient is a person, and found it inconvenient. "We'll schedule a follow-up for 'I said what I said.'" Grandma Helen's voice was sharp as cut glass. "You come in my house with your shoes on. You don't say good morning. You don't ask me how I feel. You ask her like I'm not sitting right here with ears and a mouth and 74 years of using both. And then you pick up my husband's things and call them clutter." She paused. Her breathing was labored. The speech was costing her. But her eyes were 2 points of light that would not be dimmed. "My house is not cluttered. My house is lived in. There's a difference. But I wouldn't expect you to know that because you walked through my front door like you were walking into a storage unit." Patricia's mouth opened, closed. She looked at me for rescue. I did not rescue her. "I think we're done for today," I said. I walked to the door. I opened it. The cold air came in, and I stood there holding the door the way you hold a verdict, with finality, without apology. Patricia gathered her clipboard, her bag, her squeaky shoes. She walked past me without speaking. She stepped onto the porch, and the door closed behind her. And I stood in the hallway, and I listened to my grandmother breathing hard in her chair. And I thought about the word clutter. And I thought about the wedding photograph sitting crooked on the mantel. And I thought about the rooster that my grandmother talked to on mornings when she thought no one was listening, saying things like, "Well, Robert, what do you think we should have for breakfast?" As if the ceramic bird was a direct line to my grandfather's ghost. I straightened the photograph. I centered the rooster. I sat on the floor next to Grandma Helen's chair, and she put her hand on my head, and we stayed like that until her breathing slowed. I didn't tell Min Jun about Patricia. I didn't have to. The next day, a different hospice agency called. Not the one Patricia worked for. A private agency. The woman on the phone had a voice like warm water, and she said they'd been assigned to my grandmother's case and they could start immediately. Full service, in-home, pain management, nursing support, emotional care. I asked who arranged this. She said the account had been set up by a family member. I asked which family member. She said she wasn't authorized to share that information, but she could tell me that the care package was comprehensive, the best they offered. I hung up. I looked at the white card on the refrigerator, the phone number with no name. He knew. He always knew. Not because he was watching, though he probably was, but because he understood the ecosystem of my grandmother's care the way he understood the ecosystem of everything he controlled. He saw the gaps before they became crises. He filled them before anyone asked. He operated in the space between what was needed and what was provided, and he did it silently, invisibly, with the precision of someone who had learned a long time ago that the most effective power is the power no one sees until it's already worked. Patricia was gone. I never saw her again. I never asked what happened. Some questions have answers you can live without. The new hospice nurse was named Grace. She was Jamaican, 52, with hands that were warm before they touched you, and a voice that made my grandmother close her eyes and smile. She took off her shoes at the door. She said good morning. She sat on the edge of my grandmother's bed and held her hand and said, "Tell me about your day, Miss Helen. I've got all the time in the world." Grandma Helen told her about the rooster. Then came Dr. Kessler's last appointment. Not last because we stopped going. Last because of what happened in the room. Dr. Kessler was a good oncologist. I believe that. His reputation was earned and his knowledge was real. And the treatment plan he'd developed for my grandmother was as good as anything her diagnosis allowed. But he was also a man who had been practicing medicine for 30 years. And somewhere in those 30 years, the patients had become diagnoses, and the diagnoses had become data points. And the data points had become something he managed, the way a pilot manages turbulence, with competence, but without wonder, without the raw human awareness that the body in front of him belonged to somebody who was loved. We sat in his office, Grandma Helen in the chair closest to the desk, me beside her, her hand in mine. She was having a good day, clear eyes, steady voice. She'd put on her nice earrings, the gold ones, the ones she saved for church and doctor visits because both, she said, Required you to show up looking like you meant it. Dr. Kessler sat behind his desk. He had her scans on the screen. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see, and he started talking about progression, about what the images showed, about the timeline. He used words like advancement and trajectory and anticipated decline, and he used them with the fluency of a man reciting something he'd said 1,000 times. And as he spoke, I noticed that he had not once looked at my grandmother. Not once. He spoke to me. He spoke to the screen. He spoke to his notes. He spoke about her body as if her body were a building with structural damage, and she was not the person living in it, but the unfortunate weather that had caused the decay. My grandmother sat in her nice earrings and her blue housecoat, and she listened to a man describe the end of her life without looking at her face, and her hand tightened in mine, not from pain, but from the specific hurt of being made invisible by the person who is supposed to be saving you. The scans show what we expected, he said. He clicked to a new image. Progression in the primary site, some hepatic involvement. At this stage, we're looking at comfort optimization rather than intervention. I'd recommend adjusting the pain management protocol and increasing the palliative support. We should also discuss advanced directives and end of life. I'm not dead yet. Doctor. Kessler stopped. He looked up. For the first time since we'd entered the room, he looked at my grandmother. Actually looked at her. And what he saw was a 74-year-old black woman in gold earrings who had spent 41 years working in a hospital exactly like his, who had held the hands of more dying people than he had diagnosed, who had cleaned up after doctors like him and around doctors like him and despite doctors like him, and who was now sitting in his office listening to her own death being narrated in the third person by a man who hadn't asked her a single question about how she felt. "I'm sitting right here," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was precise. Each word placed like a stone in a wall. I have ears. I have a brain. It still works most days. And I did not put on my good earrings and ride 40 minutes in a car to sit here and listen to you talk about me like I'm a chart on a screen. Dr. Kessler's mouth opened. His hands hovered over his keyboard. You want to tell me I'm dying? Tell me. Look at me and tell me. Don't tell my granddaughter. Don't tell your computer. Tell me. I've been a nurse for 41 years. I've heard it all, and I've said it all, and I know what every single one of those words means. So don't you sit there and hide behind your medical vocabulary like I don't speak the language. The room was silent. The kind of silent that only happens when someone has spoken a truth so pure that the air itself stops to listen. Dr. Kessler set his hands on the desk. He took a breath, and to his credit, to whatever remained of the young medical student who had gone into oncology because he wanted to help people, before 30 years of insurance forms and caseloads and institutional fatigue had worn the wanting down to a nub, he turned his chair to face my grandmother directly. He leaned forward. "Mrs. Atkins," he said, "I'm sorry. You're right." She nodded. Once. Not forgiveness. Acknowledgement. The nod of a woman who has trained men before and is willing to do it one more time. "Now," she said, "tell me how long I've got, and use small numbers because I'm tired." He told her. He told her looking at her face. He told her with his hands still and his voice unadorned, and something in his eyes that might have been the memory of why he became a doctor in the first place. And my grandmother listened the way nurses listen, with her whole body, absorbing the information, filing it, preparing for what comes next. She asked 2 questions, practical questions. How bad will the pain get? When will I stop knowing who people are? He answered both, honestly, gently, like a person, not a textbook. When we left, my grandmother stopped at the reception desk. The young woman behind the counter smiled at her. Grandma Helen leaned forward and said, "Tell Dr. Kessler I said he did better the second half. He'll know what that means." In the car, I cried, quietly, with the windows up and the heat on, and my grandmother in the passenger seat looking straight ahead with her gold earrings catching the light from the street lamps on North Charles Street. She didn't tell me to stop. She didn't comfort me. She let me cry the way women of her generation let people cry, without interference, without performance, with the steady patience of someone who knows that grief is a process, and the process has steps, and the steps cannot be skipped. When I was done, she said, "Stop at the store. I want honey, the good kind, in the glass jar." I stopped at the store. I bought the honey, the good kind, in the glass jar. I didn't look at the price. That evening, Minjun came. It was a Friday, his regular day. He walked in carrying the grocery bags, and he stopped. My grandmother was sitting at the kitchen table with the honey jar in front of her, the new one, the one I'd bought, and she was looking at it with an expression I couldn't read. He set the bags down. He looked at the honey. He looked at her. He looked at me. "She told the doctor off," I said. He sat down in the wobbly chair. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. "Told him she wasn't dead yet," I said. Told him to look at her when he spoke. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, a fraction of a smile. A seismic event on a face that registered emotion the way a mountain registers weather. Slowly, massively, in changes you had to know where to look to see.
"That sounds like Auntie Helen,"
he said. My grandmother reached across the table and put her hand on his. Her shaking hand on his scarred hand. Her skin against his skin. Two people who had no biological connection and no legal claim to each other, and no shared language except the one they'd built in a kitchen in 1989 out of rice and canned peaches and honey and the raw, unreasonable decision to love someone the world hadn't assigned to you. "You should have seen his face," she said. And she laughed. A real laugh, full and round and young. And for a moment, just a moment, she was 37 again, strong enough to carry anyone, tired but unbroken, walking home from a double shift in the cold, and the boy at the table was 8, and the kitchen smelled like peaches, and nobody was dying, and the honey was for tea. I started noticing the car on a Thursday, silver, 4-door. Nothing remarkable about it except that it was there, parked on the corner of Ashland and Montford, facing the house. The first time I saw it, I didn't think anything. Cars park on corners. That's what corners are for. The second time, the next morning, it was in the same spot, same angle, same dirty windshield. I looked harder. There was someone inside. I couldn't see features, just a shape. A person in the driver's seat, not moving, not on a phone, not doing anything except sitting and facing my grandmother's house. The third time, I wrote down the plate number. The fourth time, I saw a flash, quick, small, like a phone screen catching the sun, or a camera. I told Minjun on Friday, casually, not because I felt casual, but because I had learned that the way you deliver information to a man like him matters. Panic is useless. Hysteria is useless. Facts are currency. I gave him the facts. Silver car, corner of Ashland and Montford, 3 days. Someone inside. Possible camera. He was cutting vegetables. His hands didn't stop. His face didn't change. Nothing about his body shifted or tensed or reacted in any way that a normal person would consider a response to being told that someone was surveilling the house where the person he loved most in the world was dying. But I saw his jaw, the muscle that runs from the ear to the chin. It tightened. One pulse, like a heartbeat in the wrong place. And then it released.
"What color were the plates?"
he said. "Maryland, yellow and blue." He nodded. He kept cutting. He finished the sweet potatoes. He transferred them to the pot. He wiped his hands on the cloth. He folded the cloth and placed it on the counter beside the stove. Then he excused himself and stepped onto the porch, and I heard him speak in Korean, low and fast, words I couldn't separate into syllables, a sound like a river over rocks, fluid but forceful, carrying weight downstream. He came back inside. He sat down. He picked up his knife. He started on the carrots. "Don't worry about the car," he said. That night, I looked out the window before bed. The corner of Ashland and Montford was empty. The silver car was gone. It was never there again. I didn't ask what happened. There are rooms in other people's lives that you don't enter, not because you're afraid of what's inside, but because entering would make you responsible for knowing, and some knowledge is a weight that doesn't come off once you pick it up. I didn't ask. He didn't tell. The car was gone. My grandmother was safe. That was the math that mattered. But something changed after that. The men on the porch increased from 2 to 4. The Escalade was sometimes joined by a second car, a black sedan that parked at the other end of the block like a period at the end of a sentence. Minjin's visits didn't change in frequency, still Tuesdays and Fridays, but they changed in texture. He arrived earlier. He stayed later. He checked the windows before he cooked, not just when he was leaving. He watched the street from the kitchen window while the soup simmered, standing slightly to the side of the glass, not in front of it the way a person stands when they know that windows work both ways. He never told me what the silver car was. He never said the word danger or threat or enemy. He never named whatever had sent that car to my grandmother's block. But the infrastructure of his protection shifted. Quietly, efficiently, the way his money had always operated. Invisible until you knew where to look, and I was learning where to look. Uncle Terrence showed up on a Monday. Not a Tuesday, not a Friday, not any day that belonged to the rhythm Minjun and I had built around my grandmother's care. A Monday. Like he'd calculated the one day when no Escalade would be parked on Ashland Avenue, and no men in black would be standing on the porch, and the house would look like what it was. A crumbling row house in East Baltimore with a dying woman inside and a 29-year-old granddaughter drowning in medical bills and exhaustion and grief. I hadn't seen Terrence in 4 years, not since my grandfather's funeral, where he'd worn a suit that still had the price tag tucked inside the collar, and he'd stood in the back of Greater Mount Zion and checked his phone during the eulogy, and left before the repast because he had a thing. He called my grandmother once on her birthday the year after. Didn't call the year after that. Didn't call the year after that. Didn't call when she was diagnosed. Didn't call when I moved from Atlanta. Didn't call when Miss Torrey told half the neighborhood that Grandma Helen was failing. Terrence existed in that particular category of family member who defines blood as something you claim when it's convenient and forget when it costs you anything. He knocked on the door like he owned it, 3 hard raps. I opened it, and there he was, 48 years old, Grandma Helen's nephew through her husband's side, wearing a leather jacket that was trying to look expensive, and shoes that were trying to agree with the jacket, and neither one succeeding. He had a smile on his face, the kind of smile that comes preloaded, that was there before the door opened, that exists independent of anything happening on the other side. A salesman's smile. A smile that wants something. "Zuri, baby girl!" He reached for a hug. I didn't step forward. He hugged the air between us and pretended it was me. "How's my favorite niece?" "I'm your only niece." "That's why you're my favorite." He laughed. His own joke, his own audience. He looked past me into the house with the particular scanning motion of someone appraising, calculating, assessing. Not the furniture, not the photographs, but the bones of the place, the square footage, the zip code, the number that a house on Ashland Avenue might generate if the right paperwork were signed by the right person at the right time. "Where's Auntie Helen? I came to see about my auntie." 4 years. He came to see about his auntie after 4 years of nothing. I stepped aside because the alternative was a confrontation in the doorway, and my grandmother was 20 feet away in her chair, and she had ears that worked even on the bad days, and I would not let her hear me turn family away, no matter how loosely that word applied. He walked in. He didn't take off his shoes. Grandma Helen was in the living room. She was having a soft day. Not gone, but faded. The edges of her awareness blurred like a photograph taken through fog. She looked at Terrence the way she sometimes looked at people on her soft days, with a recognition that was more feeling than fact. She knew he belonged somewhere in her life, but the where and the how were underwater. "Auntie Helen!" Terrence sat on the couch across from her. Too close, too loud. The energy of a man performing affection for an audience that isn't there.
"You're looking good, Auntie. You're looking real good."
She was not looking good. She had lost 14 pounds since I'd moved in. Her housecoat hung on her like a curtain on a shrinking window. Her cheekbones were sharper than they should have been, and her wrists were thin enough that I could circle them with my thumb and forefinger. She was not looking good, and everyone in that room knew it, except the man who was saying it. Or, more accurately, the man who was saying it and didn't care whether it was true, because the words were not for her. They were for the performance. They were stage directions for the version of this visit he'd already written in his head. He talked for 45 minutes, about himself, about his job, some kind of consulting that he described in terms so vague they could have meant anything from legitimate work to standing in a parking lot with a clipboard. About his car, about his plans. He talked to my grandmother the way people talk to a television, steadily, without pause, without checking whether anyone was listening. She sat in her chair and she nodded sometimes, and sometimes she didn't, and Terrence didn't notice the difference because Terrence wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the house, at the new porch he could see through the window, at the repaired gutter, at the walls that had been freshly painted. When had they been painted? I stopped and thought about it and realized I didn't know. They'd been painted between one visit and another, quietly, while I was at Mrs. Covington's, and I hadn't asked because by then I had stopped asking, because the answers all led to the same place, the same man, the same money, the same silence. Terrence noticed the paint. He noticed everything that had monetary value. His eyes moved across the improvements the way a jeweler's eyes move across a tray of stones, professionally, acquisitively, with the trained awareness of someone who can calculate worth at a glance. "House is looking nice, Auntie," he said. "Real nice. Y'all been fixing it up?" "I've been focused on Grandma's care, Terrence." Right. He leaned back, crossed his ankle over his knee. "So listen, I've been thinking about Auntie Helen, about her situation. Her situation. Like she was a problem with a solution. Like she was a case study and not a woman in a chair. I've been talking to a buddy of mine, lawyer, real sharp guy, and he was saying, with Auntie Helen's condition, it might be a good idea to get some things in order. Power of attorney, medical proxy, estate planning, make sure the family is protected." The family. He said the family the way politicians say the people, as a concept, an abstraction, a word that covers whatever he actually meant with a blanket of implied virtue. "Terrence," I said, "Grandma already has a medical proxy. It's me." Right, he nodded, too fast. "But I'm just saying, from a legal standpoint, as her nephew, as blood, you haven't been here in 4 years. The smile dimmed. Not all the way. Terrence's smile never went all the way off. It was a pilot light, always burning, always ready to reignite the moment he calculated that warmth was the more effective tool. I know, and I feel bad about that, Zuri, I really do. Life gets busy. You know how it is." I did not know how it was. I knew how it was to drive 11 hours in a car with a cracked windshield. I knew how it was to choose between honey and chicken. I knew how it was to bathe your grandmother and button her housecoat and hold her at 3 in the morning when she screamed names you'd never heard. I knew how all of that was. What I did not know was how it was to be so busy that 4 years passed without a phone call to a woman who used to make you sweet potato pie from scratch every Thanksgiving because your own mother never learned to cook and your own father was a subject no one in the family discussed. "The house," Terrence said, and now his voice changed, dropped into something more serious, more practiced. This was the pitch. The first 45 minutes had been the warm-up. "The house is in Auntie Helen's name, right? No mortgage?" "That's not your concern, Terrence." "It is my concern. I'm family." He leaned forward. "Look, Zuri, I'm not trying to start anything. I'm trying to help. You've been here, what, 6, 7 months? You moved from Atlanta. You gave up your life. And I respect that, I do. But I'm blood. I'm her late husband's nephew. And there are legal considerations. Legal considerations. About the estate, about the property, about making sure Auntie Helen's wishes are her wishes." I stood up. I didn't plan to. My body made the decision the way it had made the decision in the grocery store when the woman behind me sighed. Not from strength, but from the depletion of everything that wasn't anger. "You want to talk about her wishes? She wished you'd call. Every Christmas she sat by that phone and she said, 'Maybe Terrence will call this year.' Every birthday, every Easter. She made a pie last Thanksgiving, Terrence. A whole pie. For you. She was already sick. Her hands were already shaking, and she stood in that kitchen for 3 hours making a sweet potato pie because she thought you might come. You didn't come. You didn't call." The pie sat on the counter for 4 days until I threw it away. And I told her you'd called to say thank you because I couldn't let her know the truth, which is that you didn't think about her at all. Terrence's smile was off now, fully off. What was underneath was smaller than I expected. Not mean, not scheming, just small. A small man in a leather jacket who had come to a dying woman's house to talk about property values because the property was the only part of her he knew how to value. "I'm gonna need you to leave," I said. "Zuri, come on." "Terrence?" My grandmother's voice, from the chair. We both turned. She was looking at him. Her eyes were clearer than they'd been all day, as if the sound of his name in her own mouth had burned through the fog like a match through paper. "I'm dying. You know that. Everybody knows that. And you come here now. After 4 years, you come here now." She wasn't angry. That was the devastating part. She wasn't angry. She was sad. The particular sadness of a woman who has spent her life loving people who don't show up and has run out of time to pretend it doesn't hurt. "Did you come here for me? Or did you come here for my house?" Terrence opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Because if you came here for me, you're 4 years too late. And I'll forgive you for that because that's what I do. But if you came here for my house, baby, you need to leave. Because this house is not an asset. This house is where I lived, where I loved, where I raised children and buried a husband and held a little boy who was bleeding in an alley. This house is my life, and it's not for sale, and it's not for probate, and it's not for anyone who couldn't be bothered to call me on my birthday." Terrence stood up. His hands were in his pockets. He looked around the room one more time. The photographs, the crochet blanket, the rooster I could see through the kitchen doorway. The hallway where the shelves my grandfather built still held the books nobody read anymore. And whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes completed itself, and the answer was that there was nothing here he could take without a fight he wasn't equipped for. "I'm sorry, Auntie," he said, and maybe he was. Maybe somewhere underneath the leather jacket and the 2 bright shoes and the buddy of mine lawyer, there was a version of Terrence who felt the weight of what he'd just done. Or maybe he was sorry the way people are sorry when they lose. Not for the harm, but for the failure. I couldn't tell. I didn't try. He left. I closed the door. I locked it. I sat on the floor next to my grandmother's chair, and she put her hand on my head and she said, "He's not a bad man, Zuri. He's just a hungry one. And hungry people eat whatever's in front of them." I didn't tell Min-jun about Terrence, but on the following Tuesday, when Min-jun arrived with his grocery bags and his knife and his silence, there was a manila envelope on the table that hadn't been there when I left for Mrs. Covington's. Inside was a copy of my grandmother's will, freshly notarized. The house was in my name. The medical directives were in my name. Everything was clean and legal and airtight. There was a business card clipped to the front page from a law firm in Columbia, Maryland. The kind of law firm that doesn't advertise. The kind that occupies an entire floor of a building with no name on the door. I looked at Min-jun. He was washing his hands at the sink. First wash. He didn't look at me. "Did you know about Terrence?" I said.
I know about everyone who comes to this house.
"Did you do this?" I held up the envelope. He dried his hands, the cloth from the drawer. He folded it, placed it on the counter. Then he looked at me.
Your grandmother asked me to protect her home. I protected her home.
He said it the way he said everything, without emphasis, without drama, without the expectation of gratitude. A fact, a completed task, a promise kept. Terrence's buddy of mine, lawyer, never called. Whatever conversation happened between that lawyer and the law firm in Columbia with no name on the door, it happened once, and it happened finally, and it was the last time Terrence's name appeared in any context related to my grandmother's estate. I don't know what was said. I don't need to. Some protections are like walls. You don't need to see the bricks being laid. You just need to know the wind stopped. 2 weeks after Terrence's visit, Min-jun took us to dinner. Not suggested, not asked, told. He walked in on a Tuesday and said, "Saturday, 6 o'clock. I'll send a car." My grandmother's face lit up the way a room lights up when someone opens the curtains. Sudden, complete, transforming the space itself. She hadn't been out to dinner since before her diagnosis. She hadn't been anywhere except the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom, Dr. Kessler's office, and the small, shrinking orbit of a life measured in rooms instead of miles. She spent 3 days deciding what to wear. 3 days. A woman whose world had collapsed to a row house on Ashland Avenue spent 3 days trying on clothes she hadn't touched in months, holding dresses up to the mirror with hands that shook, asking me which earrings, which shoes. Should she wear the blue or the green? What about the scarf Dolores gave her? The nice one, the silk one? I helped her get dressed on Saturday the way I helped her every morning, with the buttons and the zippers and the clasps. But this time it was different. This time she was smiling. This time her hands were shaking from excitement, not illness. This time she looked at herself in the mirror and said, "I still clean up nice, don't I?" And I said, "Grandma, you look beautiful." And I meant it the way you mean things that are true and temporary and precious, because they won't happen many more times. The car came at 5:45, not the Escalade, a town car, black, polished, driven by a young Korean man in a suit who opened the door for my grandmother with both hands and a slight bow and called her Halmoni, grandmother, and she patted his cheek and said, "Thank you, baby." And he smiled at her with genuine warmth because nobody was immune to Grandma Helen, not even the employees of a man who traded in fear. The restaurant was in the Inner Harbor. I don't remember the name. I remember the lighting, warm, low, amber, like being inside a jar of honey. I remember the tablecloths, white and heavy. I remember the hostess. She was young, 25 maybe, blonde, dressed in black. She stood behind the podium with the reservation book, and she looked at us. My grandmother in her green dress with the silk scarf and the gold earrings. Me in the nicest clothes I owned, which were not nice enough for this restaurant by a significant margin. And her eyes did the thing. The thing I've seen 1,000 times. The quick scan. The inventory. The calculation that takes less than a second and covers everything. Skin color, clothing quality, probable income, probable purpose, probable belonging. The math of whether you are a customer or a mistake. "Can I help you?" she said, the way you say it when you're hoping the answer is no. "We have a reservation," I said, "under Choi." Something shifted in her face. Not much. A flicker. The name meant something to her, but we didn't match it. We were the wrong color for that name. The wrong clothes. The wrong everything. "Of course," she said, and she smiled the smile that service workers smile when they've been trained to smile regardless. The smile that exists from the mouth forward and doesn't reach anything behind it. "Follow me." She led us through the restaurant, past the window tables with the harbor view, past the booths with the leather seats, past the quiet tables in the center where couples sat in candlelight and silverware clinked against porcelain with the delicate sound of money. She led us through all of it, and she seated us at a table by the kitchen door, next to the hallway that led to the bathrooms, the table where you put people you've decided aren't worth the view. I knew what she'd done. I knew it the way I knew the grocery store, the way I knew Patricia, the way I knew Dr. Kessler's office, with the bone-deep recognition of a pattern I'd been living inside my entire life. I opened my mouth to say something, to do the thing I'd been trained not to do, the thing that costs you more than it costs them, the thing that makes you the angry black woman in a restaurant, instead of the woman who was just seated next to the kitchen door. But my grandmother sat down. She smoothed the tablecloth with her palms. She placed her purse on the empty chair. She opened the menu with both hands, carefully, the way she opened everything now, with the deliberate focus of someone for whom fine motor control was a negotiation rather than a given. She looked at the menu and she smiled. Because she was at dinner. Because she was out of the house. Because she was wearing her green dress and her gold earrings. And she was alive. And the world, for all its specific cruelties, had given her a Saturday evening in a restaurant with her granddaughter. And that was enough. That was enough for her. It was not enough for me. Min Jun arrived 12 minutes later. He walked in through the front door and the restaurant changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way a room changes when the temperature drops. Everyone felt it. No one mentioned it. And the adjustments were automatic and involuntary. The hostess straightened. The manager appeared from somewhere I hadn't seen a manager before. Wait staff pivoted. Min Jun was wearing a black suit, not the burgundy. No tie. The scar visible. The phoenix visible. He walked through the restaurant the way water walks through a riverbed. Naturally, inevitably, with everything else moving aside to let him pass. He saw us. He saw where we were seated. He stopped. I watched his eyes. They moved from my grandmother to the table, to the kitchen door, to the bathroom hallway. The route the hostess had walked us along, the tables she had passed, the calculations she had made. He saw all of it in the time it took him to button his jacket. His jaw did the thing, the muscle tightening, the single pulse, the heartbeat in the wrong place. He turned to the hostess. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his expression. He spoke to her the way you speak to someone who has made a mistake that you're going to correct once and only once. I couldn't hear what he said. I didn't need to. The hostess's face went white. Not gradually, instantly, like someone had pulled a plug and all the color had drained into the floor. The manager materialized beside her, already nodding, already moving, already reaching for menus. 2 waitstaff appeared. A table by the window, the best table, the one with the harbor view and the candlelight and the heavy chairs, was cleared in under 90 seconds. Cleared and reset and waiting. Min Jun walked to our table. He extended his hand to my grandmother. She took it. He helped her stand. He walked with her through the restaurant, past the tables she'd been denied, past the booths and the candles and the silverware, and he seated her at the window table himself. He pulled out her chair. He adjusted it beneath her. He sat across from her, and the harbor lights stretched out behind them like a city bowing. The hostess did not seat anyone else for the rest of the evening. I don't know if she was sent home or simply chose to disappear. I know that every server who came to our table came with the focused, almost frightened attentiveness of people who understood that the man at table 12 was not someone whose guests you mistreated. I know that the food arrived faster than physics should have allowed. I know that the manager personally brought a dessert we didn't order and apologized for the mix-up with seating, as if proximity to a kitchen door had been an accident and not a decision. My grandmother ate. She ate slowly, carefully, with the measured attention of a woman who understood that meals were numbered and this one was a gift. She tried the soup. She tried the fish. She tried a chocolate cake that made her close her eyes and shake her head and say, "Lord have mercy," which was her highest compliment, reserved for sermons that made her cry, and sunsets that stopped her walking, and food that reminded her body that pleasure was still possible, even in the territory of dying. Minjun watched her eat. He barely touched his own plate. He sat across from her in the candlelight with the harbor behind him and the city glittering like a false promise, and he watched a 74-year-old woman in a green dress eat chocolate cake with her eyes closed. And whatever was on his face in that moment, whatever you call the thing that lives between love and grief, between gratitude and loss, between "I found you" and "I'm losing you," it was not something I'd ever seen on a human face before, and I haven't seen it since. Halfway through dinner, my grandmother looked up from her plate. She looked past Minjun, past me, at the restaurant around us, the tables, the people, the lights on the water. Then she looked at the hostess station, now empty, and then she looked at me. "Is this where she put us?" she said, pointing toward the kitchen door, toward the table we'd been seated at originally. "Over there, by the bathroom?" "Yes, Grandma." She set her fork down. She picked up her napkin. She dabbed her mouth with the specific precision of a woman who has been taught that manners are armor, and she was never without hers. Then she looked at Minjun. "So we're visible now," she said. Not to him, to the room, to the air, to every restaurant in every city where she had ever been, walked past the good tables and seated near the door. She said it without raising her voice and without lowering her head, and the words landed on the white tablecloth like a verdict that had been waiting 74 years to be delivered. Minjun looked at her. He didn't apologize for the world. He didn't explain. He didn't perform outrage or promise that it would never happen again, because they both knew that was a lie, that it would happen again, that it had been happening before he was born and would happen after they were both gone, that the hostess was not the problem, that the hostess was a symptom of a condition so old and so embedded that no amount of money or power or men in black suits could cure it. He reached across the table. He poured her more water. He said, "What else would you like to try?" And she smiled, not the sad smile, the real one, the one that meant she understood everything he'd just said by not saying it, that she accepted the limits of what he could fix and the scope of what he was willing to, that she knew this man could restructure a restaurant in 90 seconds, but couldn't restructure a country in a lifetime, and that the water he poured her was not an answer to the question she'd asked, but an answer to a different question. "Are you here?" And the answer was yes. He was here. He was always here. 3 weeks later, the threat came to the house. It was a Sunday. Minjun wasn't there. Grace, the hospice nurse, had just left. Grandma Helen was in the living room, in her chair, wrapped in the blanket, the one Minjun had found, the one that weighed exactly what safety felt like. She was having a moderate day. I was in the kitchen cleaning up when I heard the front door open. I hadn't unlocked the front door. There were 2 men in the hallway. I didn't know them. They were not Minjun's men. Min Jun's men wore black and stood still and had the polished restraint of soldiers who had been trained to be invisible. These men wore gray. They stood like they expected the house to accommodate them, like the space was already theirs. One was Korean, one was white. Both were large in the way that men are large when their size is the first thing they want you to know about them. The Korean man looked at me. He smiled. It was not a smile. It was a demonstration.
"We're here to see the old woman,"
he said. His English was clean, no accent, American-born.
"Tell her she has visitors."
My body went cold. Not the cold of fear, but the cold of recognition. The cold of understanding, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that the silver car hadn't been random, that the surveillance hadn't been casual, that whatever world Min Jun operated in had calculated the location of his vulnerability and sent two men in gray to stand in the exact spot where it lived. "You need to leave," I said. My voice was steady. It cost me everything I had to make it steady, but it was. "We just want to talk to her, deliver a message. You need to leave this house right now." The white man took a step forward. He was taller than the other one. His hands were at his sides, but they were open, fingers spread. The posture of someone who wants you to see that they could grab you if they chose to, and the fact that they haven't is a gift you should appreciate. "Zuri!" My grandmother's voice from the living room. I turned. She was standing, out of the chair, on her feet, the blanket fallen to the floor behind her. She was holding her cane, not leaning on it, holding it, up. In front of her body, both hands wrapped around the wood, her arms extended, the rubber tip pointed at the hallway like a spear, like a sword, like the only weapon in a 74-year-old woman's arsenal. But enough, because her face was the face of a woman who had survived every single thing the world had tried to do to her. The night shifts and the dying patients, and the absent son, and the dead husband, and the runaway daughter, and the cancer, and the fog, and the losing of herself piece by piece. And she was still standing. She was still standing, and she was holding a cane like a woman who intended to use it. "Nobody," she said, "is going to hurt my family in my house." The Korean man's smile faded. He looked at her, this small, sick, shaking woman in a blue housecoat with a cane in her hands, and whatever he saw in her face made him recalculate. Not because she was a threat. She was not a physical threat to anyone. A strong wind could have pushed her over. A raised hand could have ended the confrontation before it began. But what she was, what she represented, was something no amount of muscle could outweigh. She was a woman who had decided that this was the line, decided that these men, whoever they were, whatever they wanted, would not cross the threshold between the hallway and the living room where her family sat. She had decided, and the decision was in her eyes, and it was the same decision she'd made in an alley in 1989 when she'd picked up a bleeding boy she didn't know and carried him into her house. She would not let go. She never let go. I grabbed the vase from the hallway table, the tall one, ceramic, the one that hadn't held flowers since my grandfather died, but my grandmother kept because it was his mother's and therefore sacred. I grabbed it and I held it above my head and I said, "Get out!" And my voice cracked on the second word, but the vase didn't waver. The front door slammed open behind them. I don't know how his men got there that fast. I don't know if they had been close all along, stationed somewhere I couldn't see, operating on a protocol I didn't understand. 4 of them came through the door. They didn't speak. They didn't announce. They moved through the hallway like a current through a wire, fast, directed, purposeful. The 2 men in gray were on the ground in seconds. Not shot, not stabbed, put down. Silently, efficiently, with the practiced coordination of men who had done this many times and had gotten very good at making it look easy. Then Min Jun was there. I didn't see him enter. He was simply in the hallway, in the space between his men and the 2 men on the floor, and the air in the house changed the way the air changed in the restaurant, the way the air changed every time he entered a room. A pressure drop, a gravitational shift, the molecular acknowledgement that the most dangerous person present had arrived. He looked at the men on the floor. He looked at the hallway. He looked at the vase in my hands. He looked at my grandmother, still standing, still holding the cane, still shaking, but not from weakness, from fury. From the 74-year-old, undiluted, undefeated fury of a woman who had been tested by the world every day of her life and had never once backed down. He crossed the hallway. He walked past me. He walked to my grandmother, and he put his arms around her, gently, carefully, the way you hold something that is both unbreakable and fragile. Something that has survived everything, but could shatter now from the sheer exhaustion of surviving. She dropped the cane. It clattered on the hardwood. She grabbed his jacket with both fists, and she pulled him close, and she said, "Don't you let them take you again. Don't you let anybody take you from me again." And he said, "Never." In Korean, in English, in the language they had built between them that had no dictionary and no grammar and no rules except the one rule: I am here. I am not leaving. Never. His men removed the two men in gray. I don't know where they took them. I don't know what happened. The hallway was empty within minutes. The front door was closed and locked and chained. The vase was back on the table. The cane was back in my grandmother's hand. Everything was exactly as it had been, except that nothing was, and nothing would be again. That night, Min-jun didn't leave. He sat in the wobbly chair in the kitchen, and he made soup, and he made rice, and he made tea with honey, and he brought it to my grandmother in the living room, and she sat in her chair with a blanket around her shoulders, and she ate, and she drank, and she held his hand, and she didn't let go. Not for an hour, not for 2. She held his hand while the tea cooled and the night deepened, and the house on Ashland Avenue settled around them like a body settling into rest. She fell asleep holding his hand. He didn't move. I put a blanket over him. He looked at me. His eyes were red, not crying, past crying. In the territory beyond tears, where the body has simply exhausted its ability to produce them, and what remains is a rawness so deep it looks like calm if you don't know where to look. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, the first time he had ever said them to me, the first time he had acknowledged out loud that I was part of this, that my presence mattered, that the 3 of us, the dying nurse, the Mafia boss, and the caregiver granddaughter, had become something that none of us had planned and none of us could name, but all of us would defend. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "I do," he said, "because you let me come back." I went to bed. He stayed in the wobbly chair. His men stayed on the porch. The Escalade stayed on the street. And my grandmother slept in her chair with her hand in his, and I lay in the dark, listening to the house, and I thought about hands. His hands, scarred and terrible and gentle. Her hands, shaking and thin and unafraid. My hands, that had held the vase above my head like I was somebody who could fight. 3 pairs of hands that had found each other across 37 years and 2 continents, and all the distance that blood and race and money can put between people who are determined to be family anyway. The weeks after the incident were quiet. Not peaceful, quiet the way a held breath is quiet, the way the air before a storm is quiet, full of something that hasn't arrived yet, and might not. And you live in the space of that might not. And you try to call it peace, because the alternative is living in fear. And fear takes up room that you need for other things. For love, for soup, for honey in the glass jar, for Tuesday and Friday in the wobbly chair. Min-jun moved my grandmother into his home on a Thursday in April. Not forever, That's what I told myself. Not forever, just for now. Just until the threat was resolved. Just until the men in gray had been accounted for. Just until whatever war was being fought above my understanding reached a conclusion I would never be briefed on. His home was in Ellicott City, a house, not a mansion, though it was large enough that the word house felt modest. It was set back from the road behind a gate and a line of maple trees that were just beginning to bud. Inside, it was sparse, clean, the kind of space that belongs to a man who has learned to need very little because needing is a vulnerability, and vulnerability is a door, and doors can be opened by people who mean you harm. But the room he gave her was not sparse. The room he gave her was a reconstruction. My grandmother's bedroom on Ashland Avenue, rebuilt piece by piece in a house in Ellicott City. The same color walls, the same curtains, not similar, the same. Because I recognized the tiny cigarette burn on the left panel from a party in 1987 that my grandmother told me about once, and he must have heard about too, 37 years ago, from the bed in the back room where an 8-year-old boy listened to an old woman talk about her life while she thought he was asleep. The bed was the same height, the nightstand was on the same side, and on the dresser, beside the lamp, there was a ceramic rooster. Not her ceramic rooster, a different one, but so close to the original that when my grandmother walked into the room and saw it, she put her hand on her chest, and she closed her eyes, and she stood very still, and then she said, "You remembered." He remembered everything. He had been remembering for 37 years. Every detail of that kitchen, every object on every shelf, every word she'd ever said to him while she thought he was sleeping, every song she hummed, every smell, every texture, every piece of Helen Mae Atkins that had been imprinted on an 8-year-old boy's memory like a handprint in wet concrete. Permanent, detailed, sacred. He had rebuilt 1989 around her. Not to impress her, not to repay her, because the only safe place he had ever known was a kitchen on Ashland Avenue, and the only way he knew to tell her what she meant to him was to show her that he had kept it. All of it. Every single thing. I put the real rooster beside the new one. They stood together on the dresser like bookends, like sentinels, like 37 years compressed into 2 ceramic birds on a piece of furniture in a room that existed because a woman once fed a boy canned peaches and told him honey fixes everything. The last weeks were what last weeks are. Slow, full, terrible and sacred in equal measure. My grandmother's sharp days became rarer. The fog thickened. There were mornings she didn't know where she was, and evenings she didn't know who I was, and moments in between when she surfaced, gasping, like a diver breaking water, and she would look around the room with frantic, searching eyes, and I would take her hand and say, "I'm here, Grandma. You're safe. You're home." And she would squeeze my hand and the panic would drain from her face, and she would settle back into whatever country she was traveling through inside herself. The country where time doesn't work, and the living and the dead sit at the same table, and the tea is always warm. Minjin came every day now, not Tuesdays and Fridays, every day. He sat beside her bed in the mornings. He fed her when she would eat. He held the straw to her lips when she could only drink. He read to her. Not books, not newspapers, but recipes. Old recipes, handwritten, that he'd found somewhere. On cards, in her handwriting. The handwriting she must have used when she was young, before the tremor, before the fog, before the years took the steadiness from her hands. He read them to her like they were poetry. Sweet potato pie, collard greens with smoked turkey, peach cobbler, honey cake. He read the ingredients and the measurements and the instructions, and she listened with her eyes closed, and sometimes her lips moved like she was cooking along, her hands making small stirring motions on the blanket, her body remembering what her mind could not. On one of her last clear days, maybe the last, I don't know, You never know which one is the last until it's past. She asked him to sit. He sat on the edge of the bed. She took his hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were sharp, the sharpest they'd been in weeks. Like whatever was left of Helen May Atkins had gathered itself for one final act of presence. "I need you to do something for me," she said. "Anything." "Missouri." She looked at me, standing in the doorway, holding on to the frame the way his men held on to their posts, standing because sitting would mean accepting what was coming. "You look after Missouri when I'm gone." "Grandma, don't." "Hush." Not cruel, firm. The voice of a woman who has accepted what her granddaughter hasn't and needs the acceptance to be contagious. "I'm not saying this because she's weak. I'm saying this because she's been strong alone too long. And everybody who's been strong alone too long eventually needs somebody to stand next to." She looked at Minjun. Her hand in his, her eyes on his eyes. The boy and the nurse, the 8-year-old and the 37-year-old, the son she never birthed and the mother he never had. 37 years of love that never had a word for itself, that existed in honey jars and sweet potatoes and the sound of a door opening on a Tuesday afternoon. "You stand next to her," she said. He nodded. No words. His jaw was tight, the muscle pulsed. His hand closed around hers, and he held it the way you hold something you're about to lose. Not tightly, not desperately, but completely. Every finger, every joint, every square inch of contact maintained, because soon there would be no contact, and the memory of holding would be all that remained. "I will," he said. She smiled. The real smile. The crescent moon eyes, the teeth, the full face rearranging itself around joy for the last time, or nearly the last time, or the last time I could bear to count. "Good," she said. "Now somebody bring me some honey, the good kind, in the glass jar." Helen May Atkins died on a Tuesday, in the room Minjun built for her, in the bed that was the same height as her bed on Ashland Avenue, with the 2 ceramic roosters on the dresser and the curtains with the cigarette burn from 1987, and the blanket that weighed exactly what safety felt like across her feet. She died at 4:17 in the morning. I was holding her left hand. Minjun was holding her right. Grace was in the corner, monitoring, present, silent. The room smelled like honey because I'd heated some in water on the stove an hour earlier. Not for tea, not for medicine, but because the smell was hers, and I wanted the last thing her body knew to be something that meant home. She went quietly, the way nurses go, I think, without drama, without the thrashing and the gasping that movies and television promise. She just stopped. One breath, a pause, a longer pause, and then the absence of breath, which is not silence but something else, something heavier, something that fills a room the way a person used to fill it, with weight, with presence, with the specific gravity of a life that mattered. I felt it leave. Not her soul. I don't know about souls. I don't know what I believe about what happens after. But her. The her of her. The 41 years and the cane and the housecoat and the honey and the boy in the alley and the bleeding hands she'd washed and the rice she'd cooked and the peaches she'd opened and the doorframe he'd held onto and the porch she'd stood on watching the black car turn the corner. All of it left. All of it went wherever it goes, and what remained was a body in a bed in a room that had been built from memory by a man who was sitting beside it with his head bowed and his eyes closed and his scarred hands wrapped around the hand of a woman who couldn't feel them anymore. I left the room. I walked to the kitchen. I stood at the counter and I pressed my palms flat on the surface and I breathed. In, out. In, out. The way you breathe when the only alternative is screaming. I stared at the counter, at my hands on the counter, at the ring of water where a glass had been, at the jar of honey, half empty, the glass still warm from what I'd heated earlier. She was gone. She was gone, and the world was still here, and the counter was still solid under my hands, and the honey was still in the jar, and outside the sun would come up in 2 hours, and the maple trees would keep budding, and the birds would make whatever sound birds make in April in Ellicott City. And none of it would know that Helen May Atkins had stopped being alive. The world doesn't pause for a death. It doesn't even slow down. It just keeps going, indifferent, relentless. And you stand in it, and you hold on to the counter, and you breathe. The funeral was at Greater Mount Zion on Federal Street, Saturday, 11 o'clock. The church was full. I don't mean occupied, I mean full. Every pew, every seat, standing room along the walls. People I knew and people I didn't. Nurses from Bayview who hadn't seen my grandmother in years, but who remembered her hands and her voice, and the way she called everyone baby, and the way she held people who were dying, like dying was something she could walk you through, like a room, like a hallway, like a door you didn't have to open alone. One side of the church was Ashland Avenue, Miss Torrey in the front row with a handkerchief and a hat, neighbors who'd brought casseroles, church members who'd sat with my grandmother in the alto section, old friends, familiar faces, the community that had held Grandma Helen loosely for 46 years, not tightly enough to save her from anything, but present enough to show up when showing up was all that was left to do. The other side of the church was filled with men in black suits. They filed in quietly, single file, sat together, didn't speak, didn't fidget, hands folded, eyes forward. 20 of them, maybe more. Men I didn't recognize and would never know by name. Men who had stood on porches and sat in escalades and patrolled the perimeter of a row house on Ashland Avenue and a house in Ellicott City. And they were here now, in a church on Federal Street, in suits that fit perfectly, sitting in perfect rows, giving a dead woman the same formation they would have given a fallen general. When the casket entered, they all stood, both sides, Ashland Avenue and the men in black. Everyone stood together. The organ played and the choir sang, and the casket came down the aisle draped in white, and everyone was standing, and the sound of the hymn filled the church the way garlic fills a kitchen, from the floor up, settling into everything it touched. I read the eulogy. I stood at the podium with a piece of paper in my shaking hands, and I looked out at the pews, and I saw two worlds that should never have met, sitting side by side in a church in East Baltimore. And I told them about a woman who carried people. That's what I said. I said, my grandmother carried people. For 41 years, she carried people who couldn't carry themselves. She carried them at the hospital. She carried them in the neighborhood. She carried a little boy in from an alley on the coldest night of 1989, and she carried him in her heart for 37 years after that. She carried me when my mother couldn't. She carried this family when this family couldn't carry itself. And now she's gone, and I don't know who carries us now. I looked at Minjun, front row, other side. He was sitting with his hands in his lap and his back straight and his eyes fixed on the casket. He was not crying. He was past crying. He was in the territory beyond tears, where the only thing left is the decision about what you're going to do with the love that has nowhere to go now. The love that was built for a living person and must learn to live in the past tense. And that decision is the hardest decision a human being ever makes, and he was making it right now, in a pew in a church on Federal Street, surrounded by his men, facing a casket that held the only woman who had ever fed him without wanting something in return. After the service, after the burial, after the repast where Miss Torrey's mac and cheese sat on the same table as Korean side dishes that Minjun's people had brought without being asked, after the church emptied and the flowers were collected and the cars pulled away one by one like a sentence losing words, After all of it, I drove back to Ashland Avenue. The house was dark. The porch light was out. I sat in the car for a long time, looking at the row house where my grandmother had lived for 46 years. The new porch steps, the fixed gutter, the painted walls. The house that Min Jun had maintained like a shrine, and Terrence had appraised like real estate, and my grandmother had loved like a body, like a living thing, like an extension of herself that she could still feel even when she couldn't feel her own hands. I went inside. I turned on the kitchen light. The ceramic rooster was on the counter. The real one. I'd brought it back from Ellicott City. It stood there in the fluorescent light looking exactly like what it was. A cheap ceramic bird from a flea market in Annapolis that a man had bought because it reminded him of his mother's kitchen, and that his wife had talked to every morning for 11 years after he died, and that a hospice nurse named Patricia had once called clutter. I sat down at the table, the wobbly chair, my grandfather's chair, Min Jun's chair. I sat in it and I put my hands on the table where his hands had cut sweet potatoes and her hands had turned honey jars, and my hands had spread open envelopes full of money I didn't understand. 3 sets of hands, 1 table. A history nobody outside this kitchen would ever fully know. The door opened. I hadn't locked it. I had forgotten to lock it. Or maybe I hadn't forgotten. Maybe some part of me knew. Min Jun walked in carrying grocery bags, the tall brown ones. He set them on the counter. He didn't speak. He took off his shoes at the door. He washed his hands, twice. He opened the drawer beside the stove and took out the cloth. He started unpacking the bags. Rice, vegetables, ginger, sesame oil, chicken, and honey. 3 jars. Glass. The good kind. He put the honey on the second shelf of the refrigerator, lined up, the way they always were, the way they would always be. He sat down across from me, in the chair she used to sit in. He put his hands on the table. I put mine on the table. We looked at each other across the surface where a tired nurse and a bleeding boy had sat 37 years ago, eating rice and canned peaches while the harbor wind howled outside, and the world didn't know and didn't care that something was being built in this kitchen that would outlast both of them. I didn't say thank you. He didn't ask me to. I got up. I went to the stove. I started cooking. Not well. I am not my grandmother. I will never be my grandmother. My rice is too firm and my soup is too thin, and I have never in my life made sweet potato pie from scratch. But I cooked. Because the kitchen needed to be used. Because the stove needed to be on. Because the house needed to hear the sound of someone feeding someone, and the smell of garlic rising from the floor up, and the quiet click of a rice cooker doing its one job in a world that asks too much of everyone. I slid him a plate. He looked at it. He looked at me. He picked up his spoon. He ate. Neither of us spoke. The rooster watched from the counter. The honey glowed on the shelf, and outside, Ashland Avenue did what it always did. Existed. Endured. Leaned against itself like old friends too tired to stand alone. We were family now. Not by blood, not by law, not by any system the world recognizes, or any document a court would accept. We were family the way the only kind of family that matters is made. By a kitchen table and a jar of honey, and a cold night in 1989, when a woman too tired to stand decided a boy too broken to walk was worth carrying home. Grandma Helen was right. Honey does fix everything. Not the way medicine fixes, not the way money fixes, the way memory fixes, the way showing up fixes, the way choosing someone fixes. You pour it slow, you let it settle, you wait. It holds.